Tonight we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. And if you're settling in now with your pillow just right and your blankets arranged in that perfect cocoon of comfort, you're about to embark on a journey through Sumerian temples, ancient cosmologies, and the deeply strange intersection of archaeology and mysticism, where scholars argue passionately about cylinder seals, while the rest of us just try to figure out why anyone thought building a ziggurat was a good use of limited Bronze Age resources. So let's begin in the city of Uruk, around 3200 BCE, where the White Temple stood gleaming on its massive platform, rising above the Mesopotamian plain like a limestone finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. And this wasn't just any temple, this was the house of Anu, the sky god, built with mathematical precision that modern engineers still find impressive, though honestly, if you had thousands of workers and unlimited mud bricks, you could probably build something impressive too. But I digress, because the White Temple featured a central hall with elaborate buttressing, precise astronomical alignments, and a sacrificial altar where priests would perform rituals that we're still decoding from cuneiform tablets. And here's where it gets interesting, or perhaps where you start to drift off, which is entirely the point of this exercise. The temple served as both a religious center and an administrative hub, because in ancient Sumer there was no separation between church and state. They were the same entity, which depending on your perspective is either deeply efficient or a complete nightmare, and the priests kept meticulous records of everything: grain stores, livestock, marriages, divorces, business transactions, astronomical observations, all pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, creating the world's first bureaucracy. And if you think modern, paperwork is tedious. Imagine having to literally bake your forms to preserve them, though I suppose there's something satisfying about that permanence, knowing your grocery list will outlast you by 4,000 years. And speaking of permanence, the Sumerians believed the world was eternal, that it had always existed and always would. There was no creation from nothing in their cosmology, just an endless cycle of order emerging from chaos and returning to chaos, like a cosmic tide. And this brings us to our first scholarly debate, because some researchers argue that Sumerian cosmology influenced later creation myths, including the biblical Genesis, while others insist the similarities are superficial and that we're projecting our monotheistic frameworks onto a polytheistic culture that would have found our religious concepts utterly baffling. Professor Samuel Noah Kramer spent decades arguing that Sumerian literature provided the template for much of Western civilization's foundational stories, while other scholars like Thorkild Jacobson suggested we need to understand Sumerian religion on its own terms, not as a primitive version of something that came later. And honestly, both positions have merit, though good luck getting academics to admit that, because academic debates are where nuance goes to die and everyone picks their hill to die on, sometimes literally, I mean metaphorically, though some of those conferences do get heated. But back to our temple, because you probably won't survive this. Not the video, obviously. You'll survive the video just fine, but if you were transported back to ancient Uruk, your chances of making it more than a few weeks would be pretty slim. Between the diseases your immune system has never encountered, the complete lack of modern sanitation, the political instability, the very real possibility of being conscripted into manual labor or warfare, and the diet that would probably give you scurvy within months. Ancient Mesopotamia was not a vacation destination, though the beer was apparently quite good. They had 17 different words for beer, which tells you something about their priorities, and now seems like the perfect moment to mention that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'd rather have a smaller audience of people who actually appreciate ancient Sumerian administrative practices than a large audience of people who clicked by accident and are now mildly annoyed. And if you're listening to this at bedtime, wherever you are in the world, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you in Tokyo at 2 a.m., unable to sleep and seeking the dulcet tones of someone explaining cuneiform? Are you in London on a rainy evening? Or perhaps you're in Sao Paulo or Mumbai or somewhere I've never heard of? Geography is vast, and I am but one person with limited knowledge, And knowing that people all over the world are simultaneously learning about ancient Mesopotamia while trying to fall asleep brings me a strange comfort, like we're all part of some global insomnia support group. Except instead of counting sheep, we're counting ziggurats, which is essentially the same thing but with more baked bricks. And speaking of comfort, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because we're about to explore the concept of the antediluvian world, that mysterious time before the Great Flood that appears in Sumerian mythology. And before you ask, yes, there probably was a significant flood in ancient Mesopotamia. Floods happened regularly in that region. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't exactly known for their predictability, but the Sumerian king list, that fascinating document that chronicles rulers from the dawn of kingship, describes a time before the flood. When kings reigned for impossibly long periods, we're talking tens of thousands of years per ruler, which is either metaphorical, a copying error, a different counting system, or evidence that ancient Sumerians were very, very bad at math, though personally I suspect it's a combination of mythological time and an attempt to give their civilization a sense of immense antiquity, because every culture wants to be older than everyone else. It's like a historical superiority complex. And here's where the fringe interpretations come in, because some enthusiasts claim these impossibly long reigns are evidence of extraterrestrial intervention, that the antediluvian kings were actually aliens or human-alien hybrids. Which, sure, why not? If you're going to misunderstand ancient mythology, you might as well commit to it completely. And look, I'm not saying ancient astronaut theories are historically accurate. I'm saying they're historically hilarious. The idea that ancient peoples couldn't figure out basic engineering without help from space visitors is weirdly condescending, as if humans in 3000 BCE were somehow less intelligent than us, when in reality they were probably more observant, more resourceful, and certainly better at survival than any of us would be without our smartphones and grocery stores. But the appeal of ancient astronaut theories makes sense. They offer simple explanations for complex questions, and simple explanations are comforting, even when they're wrong. Especially when they're wrong actually, because reality is messy and complicated and doesn't fit into neat narratives, which is why we're here, in the mess, sifting through clay tablets and trying to understand what people meant when they wrote about Enki creating humans from clay and divine blood. And this creation story is genuinely fascinating, because in Sumerian mythology, humans weren't created out of love or divine generosity. We were created to do work the gods didn't want to do, which is possibly the most relatable origin story ever. Like, the gods looked at all the manual labor involved in maintaining the universe and thought, you know what? Let's create beings to do this for us. And thus humanity was born to serve as divine workers, which explains a lot about the human condition actually. We're cosmically middle management, stuck between the divine and the natural world, trying to fill out TPS reports in cuneiform, and the Sumerians understood this. They built their entire religious system around the idea that humans existed to serve the gods through temple offerings, sacrifices, festivals, and the maintenance of cosmic order, which sounds exhausting and probably was exhausting, but at least they had beer. Remember, 17 words for beer. That's not a civilization that's completely lost its way, and the temples were essentially massive economic engines, controlling vast agricultural lands, employing scribes, craftsmen, farmers, merchants, everyone, and the priests who ran these temples were among the most powerful people in Sumerian society, which leads to an interesting question: were the priests true believers or cynical operators using religion to maintain power? And the answer is probably both, because humans are complicated and capable of sincere belief and self-interested behavior simultaneously. It's not one or the other, it's both, always both. And this duality runs through all of human history. The tension between genuine faith and institutional power, between spiritual seeking and material control, and the Sumerians navigated this tension in their own way, creating a civilization that lasted for millennia. which is more than most civilizations can say. I mean, the United States hasn't even made it 300 years yet. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But Sumer lasted from around 4500 BCE to 1900 BCE. That's 2.5 millennia of continuous cultural development. And during that time, they invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, literature, law codes, bureaucracy, and standardized beer recipes, which is honestly an impressive list. And yet we barely teach this in schools. We jump straight from prehistory to Egypt, maybe briefly mention Mesopotamia, and then move on to Greece and Rome, as if the foundation of all Western civilization wasn't built on Sumerian innovations. And this historical myopia is frustrating because understanding where our institutions come from helps us understand why they function the way they do, why we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, all Sumerian base 60 mathematics, and why we organize our societies around written law, temples, markets, schools, all innovations that emerged in ancient Sumer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're supposed to be exploring the silent world, that time before divine intervention, when according to Sumerian mythology, humans lived in a state of nature, without language, without culture, without the gifts the gods would eventually bestow. And this mythological prehistory is interesting because it suggests the Sumerians understood that their civilization was constructed, not natural, that there was a time before cities, before writing, before all the structures that defined their world, and archaeological evidence supports this. We can trace the development of Sumerian culture from small agricultural villages to the great city-states. We can see the gradual emergence of social stratification, specialized labor, monumental architecture, all the markers of civilization. But what we can't fully access is the subjective experience of that transformation, what it felt like to live through the agricultural revolution, to watch villages become cities, to see writing emerge from simple counting tokens to complex literary texts. And this is where history becomes meditation, because we're trying to imagine consciousness across vast temporal and cultural distances, trying to understand how people made sense of their world when that world was fundamentally different from ours. And the exercise is probably impossible, but it's worth attempting anyway, because the attempt itself teaches us something about the limits of historical knowledge, about how much we can and cannot know about the past, and about how our own assumptions shape what we think we see when we look backward through time. And as you lie there, comfortable in your modern bed with your modern pillow and your modern ability to listen to someone ramble about ancient Sumer, consider how alien this moment would seem to an ancient Sumerian. The technology, the leisure time, the fact that you can access information about their civilization without visiting a temple or consulting a priest, and consider how alien their world would seem to you. The omnipresence of ritual, the total integration of religion into daily life, the acceptance of social hierarchy as divinely ordained, the different relationship with time, with death, with the natural world, and in this moment of consideration, maybe we can find some appreciation for both the continuity and the difference, the way humans remain fundamentally human across millennia, seeking meaning, building communities, telling stories, and also the way each culture is genuinely unique, shaped by specific material conditions, environmental factors, technological capabilities, and historical contingencies, and this balance between human universality and cultural specificity is what makes history fascinating, at least to me, and hopefully to you as well. Otherwise, this is going to be a very long video for you, but we're just getting started. We haven't even discussed the me yet, those divine decrees that governed reality in Sumerian cosmology. We haven't explored Eridu, the first city, where Enki dwelt in his underwater palace. We haven't examined the cylinder seals that provide so much of our visual information about Sumerian life. We haven't delved into the economic texts that reveal the price of barley in 2400 BCE. And yes, we know the price of barley in 2400 BCE because the Sumerians wrote it down. Everything was written down: inventories, receipts, contracts, complaints, love letters, hymns, laments, every aspect of life pressed into clay and baked into permanence, creating an archive of human experience that survived when the civilization itself vanished. And isn't that something? The words outlasted the people who wrote them, the tablets outlasted the cities, the stories outlasted the storytellers, which is either profoundly moving or deeply sad, probably both. And as we continue through this night, through this exploration of the silent world, keep that in mind, that we're reading the words of people who died thousands of years ago, people who had hopes and fears and dreams just like us, who complained about their jobs and their families and the government just like us, who looked up at the same stars we see. Well, not the same stars exactly. They've moved. Stellar drift is a thing. But you know what I mean, the same sky, the same moon, the same sun, the same fundamental human experience of being alive and trying to make sense of existence. And if that doesn't help you sleep, I don't know what will, because there's something deeply calming about the vastness of history, about understanding that your problems, whatever they are temporary, that civilizations rise and fall, that nothing lasts forever, and that's okay. Actually, it's more than okay, it's beautiful. The impermanence is what makes it meaningful, and the Sumerians understood this too. Their literature is full of meditations on mortality, on the fleeting nature of life, on the importance of making your mark while you can, and they made their mark. Oh boy, did they make their mark, creating a civilization that influenced everything that came after. And now, 4,000 years later, we're still talking about them, still learning from them, still trying to understand what they understood about the human condition. And maybe that's the real divine intervention, not gods coming down from heaven to interfere in human affairs, but humans reaching across the void of time to touch other humans, to communicate, to share knowledge, to say we were here, we lived, we mattered, we thought about the same things you think about, we wondered about the same things you wonder about. We're not so different, you and us, just separated by time and technology, but fundamentally the same creatures trying to survive and find meaning in a chaotic universe. And on that note of cosmic solidarity with ancient Sumerians, let's take a breath and prepare to move deeper into this exploration, into the structures and beliefs that defined the silent world, that time before the gods allegedly intervened to give humans the gifts of civilization. Though between you and me, I think humans gave themselves those gifts. The gods were just good branding, but we'll explore that more as we continue. For now, just breathe, relax, let the weight of 4,000 years of history settle over you like a blanket, heavy but comforting, grounding you in the vast continuum of human experience, and know that whatever you're dealing with in your modern life, it's okay. People have been dealing with stuff for thousands of years, and somehow we keep going, keep building, keep creating, keep pressing our stories into whatever medium we have available, whether that's clay or paper or digital files. The impulse is the same, the need to communicate, to preserve, to reach across time and say, here, look, this is what we did, this is what we thought, this is what we were, remember us. The city of Eridu rises from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia like a fever dream made manifest in mud brick, and according to Sumerian tradition this was the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven, which is a poetic way of saying that someone figured out how to organize people into a hierarchical society and everyone else just went along with it, probably because the alternative was chaos and starvation. And in Eridu, the temple of Enki stood at the center of everything, both literally and metaphorically, because Enki was the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of crafts and creation, and in a desert environment where fresh water meant the difference between life and death, a god of fresh water was pretty much the most important deity you could have, more important than war gods or sky gods or any of the flashier deities who got more attention in the mythology but less attention in daily prayers, because you can survive without war, but you cannot survive without water, and the Sumerians understood this intimately, building their entire civilization around the management of water resources, creating complex irrigation systems that required tremendous cooperation and engineering skill. And here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective, because the construction of these irrigation systems required centralized planning and authority. You can't have dozens of individual farmers deciding where to dig canals. You need someone coordinating the effort, making decisions, allocating resources, and that need for coordination is probably what led to the emergence of centralized authority, the temple bureaucracy, and eventually kingship, which means that civilization as we know it emerged not from divine decree but from the practical necessity of water management, though I'm sure the priests would disagree with that assessment. They'd argue that the gods provided the wisdom necessary for irrigation, and fine, maybe they did. I wasn't there, I can't prove otherwise, but it seems more likely that humans figured it out through trial and error, flooded fields, dried up crops, gradual learning over generations, the way humans figure out everything, through experimentation and occasionally catastrophic failure. And speaking of catastrophic failure, let's talk about the Great Flood myth, because every ancient Near Eastern culture has one. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, even the Hebrews, and scholars have debated for over a century whether these myths reference a real historical event, or whether floods were so common in Mesopotamia that every generation experienced something they considered apocalyptic. Professor Irving Finkel has argued that there's geological evidence of a massive flood in the region around 2900 BCE, while other scholars suggest we're pattern-seeking in random data, trying to find the historical kernel in mythological stories that were never meant to be historical in the first place. And honestly, both interpretations have problems. The flood as historical event interpretation requires us to believe that oral traditions preserved accurate information about a specific flood for potentially thousands of years, which seems unlikely. But the flood as pure myth interpretation requires us to ignore the fact that all these cultures independently developed similar stories, which also seems unlikely, unless we accept that flooding was so central to Mesopotamian life that of course everyone developed flood myths, and maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. Maybe there were multiple catastrophic floods, and maybe the myth is an amalgamation of many events crystallized into one narrative. The way trauma often works in cultural memory, multiple experiences compressed into a single representative story. And this brings us to the fringe interpretation, because some researchers, and I'm using the term researchers very loosely here, claim that the flood myth is evidence of ancient climate catastrophe caused by either a comet impact or rapid glacial melting at the end of the last ice age. And look, was there rapid environmental change during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene? Yes, absolutely. Does this explain the flood myth? Maybe, possibly, probably not. Because the flood myths we have describe events that happened within human memory, not 12,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age, but facts have never stopped a good fringe theory, and there's something almost admirable about the dedication required to connect dots that don't want to be connected. It takes work to see patterns where none exist, to construct elaborate theories that explain everything and therefore explain nothing. But I digress. We were talking about Eridu and Enki, the wise god who lived in an underwater palace called the Abzu, which was both the dwelling place of the god and the source of all fresh water, the aquifer beneath the earth that fed the rivers and made life possible. And this dual meaning is important. The Abzu is simultaneously a mythological location and a physical reality. It's the groundwater and the god's home, and this blurring of mythological and physical reality is characteristic of Sumerian thought. They didn't have our modern categories, our distinction between literal and metaphorical, natural and supernatural. It was all one integrated reality. The gods were real forces that operated through natural phenomena, and natural phenomena were manifestations of divine will, and trying to separate these categories is a modern impulse that the Sumerians would have found bizarre, like asking whether the river is water or God. It's both, obviously. How could it be otherwise? And this integrated worldview is actually quite sophisticated once you stop trying to force it into modern analytical categories. The Sumerians weren't confused or primitive, they had a different epistemology, a different way of knowing and categorizing reality, and that difference deserves respect rather than dismissal, though good luck getting that across to people who think ancient peoples were all superstitious fools waiting for the Enlightenment to save them, which is perhaps the most arrogant assumption in all of Western historiography, the idea that we're the culmination of human development, that history is progressive and we're at the peak, when in reality, we're just another point on the continuum. No better or worse than ancient Sumerians, just different, with different tools and different problems and different ways of making sense of existence. and in some ways we're actually worse, because we've lost that integrated worldview. We've separated the sacred and the profane, the natural and the cultural, mind and body, self and community, and all those separations come with costs, alienation, anxiety, the feeling that something's missing even when all our material needs are met. And maybe what's missing is the sense that we're embedded in a meaningful cosmos, that our actions matter not just to us but to the larger order of reality. And the Sumerians had that. Their entire lives were meaningful because they were part of the divine plan. Every action from planting crops to baking bread to raising children was a participation in cosmic order. And yes, that worldview also justified social hierarchy and inequality. Nothing is perfect. Every system has trade-offs, but at least they had meaning, whereas we have Netflix and anxiety. Though to be fair, I assume ancient Sumerians also had anxiety, they just expressed it differently, probably through prayers to Enki, or offerings at the temple, or whatever the Bronze Age equivalent of therapy was, maybe complaining to their neighbors. Humans have been complaining to their neighbors since the invention of neighbors. It's practically our defining characteristic. We're the species that figured out language primarily so we could express dissatisfaction more precisely. And on that cheerful note, let's discuss the me, those divine decrees that governed all aspects of reality in Sumerian cosmology. There were over 100 me, covering everything from kingship to warfare to music to sex to poetry to betrayal. Basically, every human activity and natural phenomenon had its corresponding me, its divine decree that made it possible and gave it structure. And the gods could gift these me to each other or to humans, or they could be stolen. There's a wonderful myth about Inanna, the goddess of love and war, getting Enki drunk and stealing the me from him, which is quite possibly the best mythology ever. A goddess uses beer to steal the fundamental decrees of reality from a god, and when he sobers up and realizes what happened, he tries to get them back. But it's too late. She's already returned to her city with the me, and now her city will be great and powerful. And he's just hung over with regrets, which is both hilarious and probably a metaphor for something, maybe the transfer of power between cities, or the way cunning can overcome wisdom, or just a really good story about the dangers of drinking too much. Though given that the Sumerians had 17 words for beer, they clearly weren't too worried about the dangers of drinking. They were a civilization that took its alcohol seriously, and honestly, can you blame them? If you lived in ancient Mesopotamia, you'd probably drink too. The heat, the labor, the constant threat of flood or drought, or warfare or disease. A good beer at the end of the day seems entirely reasonable, though probably their beer was more nutritious and less alcoholic than modern beer, more like liquid bread, which makes sense because it was made from barley and provided significant calories. It wasn't just for getting drunk, it was actual sustenance, and workers were paid partially in beer rations. There are tablets recording exactly how much beer various workers received, different qualities for different social ranks. Obviously the priests got the good stuff. And this brings us to social stratification. Because Sumerian society was deeply hierarchical, you had the Lugal or king at the top, though early on the Ensi or priest king was more common, then the priests and temple administrators, then merchants and craftsmen, then farmers, and at the bottom slaves. Though Sumerian slavery was different from later forms, more like indentured servitude, people could become enslaved through debt but could also work their way out of slavery. It wasn't the racial chattel slavery that would develop later, it was economic slavery, which is still slavery and still terrible but at least theoretically escapable, and scholars debate how rigid these social categories were, some arguing that Sumer had more social mobility than later Mesopotamian cultures, others arguing that the hierarchy was as rigid as anywhere else in the ancient world, and the truth is probably that it varied by time and place and circumstance, because Sumer wasn't a monolithic culture, it was dozens of city-states over thousands of years, each with its own traditions and structures, and trying to generalize about all of Sumerian civilization is like trying to generalize about all of European civilization. You can make some broad statements but the specifics vary wildly, and this is something that popular history often misses, the diversity within ancient cultures. We treat them as if they were uniform, as if every Sumerian believed the same things and lived the same way, when in reality there was probably as much diversity of belief and practice in ancient Sumer as there is in any modern society. People are people. We're diverse and contradictory and complicated, and that was true 4,000 years ago just as it's true today, though admittedly we have less evidence of that diversity because What survives is the official record, the temple archives and royal inscriptions, not the personal letters and private thoughts of ordinary people. Though we do have some of those, there are personal letters complaining about business deals, about family matters, about neighbors, and they're remarkably relatable. People worried about the same things then that we worry about now: money, relationships, reputation, health, the basic human concerns that transcend time and culture. And reading these letters is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it confirms our shared humanity, unsettling because it makes you realize how much hasn't changed. We have better technology, but the same fundamental struggles, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to transcend the human condition, but to accept it, to find meaning within it rather than trying to escape it. Though good luck selling that philosophy to Silicon Valley types who think we can upload our consciousness and live forever, as if consciousness is just software that can be copied, as if we're not fundamentally embodied beings whose experience of reality is inseparable from our physical existence. But I'm getting off topic. We were talking about social hierarchy and the me and the structure of Sumerian society, and the important thing to understand is that this structure wasn't seen as arbitrary or oppressive, at least not by those who created the texts we have. The hierarchy was divinely ordained. Each person had their place in the cosmic order, and fulfilling your role was how you maintained Ma'at, except that's Egyptian. The Sumerians didn't have Ma'at, they had Kitu or something similar. The point is that social order and cosmic order were the same thing. To rebel against your social position was to rebel against the gods, which made social control much easier. You don't need a police force if everyone believes that stepping out of line will anger the deities and bring catastrophe. Though of course they still had laws and punishments, because belief only goes so far and humans are humans. We're going to test boundaries and break rules. That's what we do. It's how we learn and grow and occasionally improve our societies, through boundary testing and rule breaking. Though if you're a king or priest, you'd rather people not do that. Hence the emphasis on divine order and cosmic stability. Change is threatening to those in power, always has been, always will be. And the myth of the silent world, that time before divine intervention, serves a purpose in this context. It justifies the current order by contrasting it with the chaos that came before. Before the gods gave humans civilization, we lived like animals, without language, without culture, without law. And aren't you glad the gods intervened? Aren't you grateful for this hierarchy that organizes your life and gives you meaning? Never mind that the hierarchy also exploits your labor and limits your opportunities. Focus on the meaning, focus on the order. Don't think too hard about who benefits from this arrangement. And this is where the fringe interpretation actually gets something right. Not the ancient astronaut stuff, but the recognition that mythology serves political purposes, that stories about gods and creation are often justifications for existing power structures, and while mainstream scholars recognize this too, they're usually more subtle about it. They talk about legitimation and social reproduction rather than bluntly saying the myths were propaganda. But let's be honest, the myths were propaganda, effective propaganda, beautiful propaganda, propaganda that has survived for 4,000 years and still shapes how we think about civilization and order and human nature, but propaganda nonetheless. And recognizing that doesn't diminish the myths, it makes them more interesting, because now we can ask who benefited from these stories. What alternatives were suppressed? What other ways of organizing society might have existed but were forgotten because they didn't win? History is written by the winners and the survivors, and Sumerian history as we know it is the history that the temple scribes chose to preserve. The royal inscriptions that kings paid for, the religious texts that priests maintained, and somewhere in the gaps, in the silences, in the stories not told, are the alternatives, the resistance, the people who didn't fit into neat categories, who questioned the divine order, who imagined different possibilities, but we don't hear their voices because they didn't control the means of textual production. They didn't have scribes and clay and the authority to make their words permanent, and so they're lost to us, forgotten, erased from history, and this erasure is itself historical violence, the way certain voices are included and others excluded, certain experiences validated and others dismissed, and we do this too. Right now, in our own time, we're deciding what to preserve and what to forget, whose stories matter and whose don't, and future historians will judge us for our choices just as we judge the Sumerians for theirs, and maybe they'll wonder why we preserved so much nonsense. So much trivia, so much documentation of meaningless moments, while failing to adequately record the experiences of marginalized communities, the daily lives of ordinary people, the quiet moments of beauty and connection that don't make it into official records. And maybe they'll laugh at us, at our priorities, at what we thought was important, just as we sometimes laugh at the Sumerians for their exhaustive barley inventories, as if anyone 4,000 years later would care exactly how much barley was stored in the temple of Inanna in 2350 BCE, except we do care, because those inventories tell us about economic systems, about climate conditions, about trade networks, about the material basis of civilization, and maybe our descendants will find our digital detritus equally fascinating, all our social media posts and text messages and search histories a complete record of human consciousness in the early 21st century, or maybe they'll find it depressing. All this technology, and we used it mostly to argue with strangers and look at pictures of cats. Though honestly, the Sumerians probably would have loved cat pictures if they'd had the technology. Humans are humans. We like cute animals. It's not a modern failing, it's a human constant. And on that note, let's return to Eridu and the Temple of Enki, because we've gotten distracted, which is easy to do when discussing ancient Mesopotamia. There's just so much, so many layers, so many connections. It's like trying to describe a vast web where every thread connects to every other thread, and pulling on any one thread unravels a dozen others, which is both the challenge and the joy of studying ancient history, the way everything interconnects, the way you can't understand the religious system without understanding the economic system, and you can't understand the economic system without understanding the environmental conditions, and you can't understand the environmental conditions without understanding the climate history, and it all spirals outward into complexity, beautiful, overwhelming complexity. The cuneiform tablets speak across millennia in wedge-shaped impressions that once were soft clay, and each tablet is a miracle of preservation, a message in a bottle thrown across the ocean of time, and we're the ones standing on a distant shore 4,000 years later finding these bottles and trying to decode what they say, and sometimes what they say is profound, hymns to the gods, epic poetry, philosophical speculation about the nature of existence, and sometimes what they say is mundane, receipts for grain, contracts for the sale of land, complaints about defective copper ingots, and both the profound and the mundane tell us something important about Sumerian civilization, because a culture is not just its great works and lofty ideals, it's also the daily transactions, the petty grievances, the ordinary business of living, and the Sumerians documented all of it. They wrote everything down, which is either admirable thoroughness or bureaucratic overreach depending on your perspective. Personally, I think it's both. Admirable because it gives us an unprecedented window into ancient life. Overreach because nobody needs to document every single barley transaction, though I suppose if you're managing a temple economy with thousands of workers, you do need to track everything or the system collapses into chaos. So maybe the bureaucracy was necessary, maybe the alternative was economic disaster, though that doesn't make it any less tedious. And I imagine Sumerian scribes probably complained about the tedium just as modern accountants complain about spreadsheets. The tools change, but the essential boringness of accounting persists across millennia, which is oddly comforting, knowing that some things never change, that people have been bored by administrative work since the invention of administrative work, and the invention of administrative work is itself fascinating because it represents a fundamental shift in human consciousness, the move from personal memory to external record-keeping, from face-to-face exchange to abstract documentation, from immediate relationships to institutional procedures, and this shift enabled the growth of larger, more complex societies. You can't manage a city-state of tens of thousands of people through personal relationships alone. You need systems, records, rules that apply regardless of personal connection, and the Sumerians built those systems, created the institutional frameworks that would be adopted and adapted by every subsequent civilization in the Near East. And this is why understanding Sumer matters, not because they're exotic or mysterious, but because they invented the basic tools of civilization, writing, law, bureaucracy, education, and we're still using those tools, still living in institutional structures that trace back to Sumerian innovations. Though admittedly we've made some improvements, we don't have to bake our documents anymore, which is nice, though we have lost the satisfaction of smashing documents we don't like. There was probably something cathartic about taking a tablet, recording a debt you'd paid, and just smashing it, destroying the evidence in a shower of clay shards, whereas deleting a digital file lacks that visceral satisfaction. You just hit delete and it's gone, no drama, no physical release, just empty space where data used to be. But I'm romanticizing clay tablets. They were probably annoying, heavy, fragile in wet conditions, though fireproof, which is more than can be said for paper. And there's something to be said for a storage medium that survives 4,000 years. Our digital files will be lucky to survive 40 years. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Bit rot is real. And we're currently in the process of creating a dark age for future historians, a period where we generated more data than any previous civilization, but stored it in formats that won't be readable a century from now, which is ironic. The Sumerians, who had less advanced technology, created more durable records than we do with our advanced technology, though to be fair, they created far fewer records. They couldn't spam their friends with clay tablets. The medium imposed natural limits on communication. You really had to want to say something to go through the effort of writing it in cuneiform, whereas we can send messages with essentially no effort, and so we do, constantly, filling the universe with noise, and maybe that's progress. Maybe more communication is always better, though I suspect quality matters more than quantity. One carefully considered cuneiform tablet probably conveyed more meaning than 1,000 text messages. But who am I to judge? I'm making a video about ancient Sumer for people trying to fall asleep. I'm not exactly optimizing for quality over quantity here. I'm optimizing for length and gentle droning, and just enough interesting content to hold attention without being too stimulating, which is a weird optimization target. But here we are. And speaking of weird optimization targets, let's discuss the Sumerian education system, because they had one, the Aduba, or tablet house where scribes were trained, and it was rigorous. Students spent years learning thousands of cuneiform signs, memorizing lists of words, copying standard texts, practicing until they could write quickly and accurately, and it was brutal. We have tablets describing the corporal punishment students received for mistakes. They were beaten with sticks, which sounds terrible and was terrible. But in a society where literacy was the gateway to social mobility, where becoming a scribe meant escaping manual labor and gaining access to power and privilege, parents probably considered the beatings a small price to pay, and this raises uncomfortable questions about education and coercion, about whether learning requires suffering. And the answer is no, obviously no, but many societies have believed otherwise, have believed that students need to be forced to learn, that education is something imposed rather than nurtured, and we still see remnants of this attitude today, the idea that school should be difficult and unpleasant, that if students are enjoying themselves they're not really learning, which is nonsense, but persistent nonsense, and the Sumerians would probably agree that it's nonsense, even as they beat their students, because humans are consistently inconsistent. We believe one thing and do another. We claim to value kindness while being cruel, and this contradiction is not unique to any culture or time period. It's a human universal. We are all hypocrites to some degree, falling short of our own ideals, and maybe recognizing this is the first step toward actually living up to those ideals, or maybe not. Maybe we're doomed to perpetual hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another forever, which is depressing but possibly accurate. And on that cheerful note, let's discuss the cylinder seals, those small carved stones that Sumerians used to mark property and documents. They'd roll the seal across wet clay, creating a distinctive impression that served as a signature. And these seals are works of art, tiny masterpieces of carving depicting gods and heroes and animals and geometric patterns, and modern scholars debate the meaning of the imagery. Professor Dominique Collin has argued that the seals reflect the owner's profession or social status, while others suggest they're religious amulets meant to invoke divine protection, and probably both interpretations are correct. The seals served multiple purposes simultaneously, practical and symbolic, administrative and spiritual. Because the Sumerians didn't separate these categories, a seal that marks your property is also a seal that invokes divine favor. And why wouldn't it be both? Why would you ever do anything without invoking divine favor? Every action is religious. When the gods permeate reality, when there's no distinction between sacred and profane, and this is what we've lost in the modern world, not the gods specifically, but the sense that ordinary actions have cosmic significance, that signing a document or marking property matters beyond its immediate practical effect, that we're embedded in a meaningful universe rather than floating in meaningless void, and maybe we're better off without that sense, maybe it was limiting and oppressive. Or maybe we've lost something essential and we're frantically trying to fill that void with consumerism and entertainment and self-help books, and neither interpretation is entirely right or entirely wrong, because complexity exists, trade-offs exist. Every cultural change involves gains and losses, and mature analysis acknowledges both rather than pretending that history is simple progress or simple decline. It's neither. It's change, and change is neutral. What matters is what we do with it, and the Sumerians did remarkable things with the changes they experienced. The transition from village to city, from oral culture to literate culture, from kinship organization to institutional organization. They navigated these transitions and created something unprecedented, a literate urban civilization that lasted millennia. And yes, it had problems: inequality, violence, environmental degradation. The Sumerians' over-irrigation led to soil salinization that damaged agricultural productivity. They made mistakes, big mistakes, mistakes that contributed to the eventual decline of their civilization, but they also made achievements that continue to shape human life. And that's what we should remember. Not that they were perfect, but that they were human, trying and failing and trying again, building and destroying and building again, just like us, just like every human society that has ever existed. And if you're lying there thinking about your own failures and mistakes, about the things you've tried that didn't work out, about the ways you've fallen short of your own ideals, know that you're in good company. Humans have been failing for thousands of years. It's what we do. We fail and we learn and we keep going, and sometimes we create something beautiful in the process, and sometimes we don't. But we keep going anyway, because what else is there to do? And the Sumerians kept going through floods and droughts and invasions and internal conflicts. They kept building and creating and documenting and believing, and their persistence paid off. They're immortal now. Their civilization survived in the form of texts and artifacts and influence. They won the ultimate victory. They're remembered. We're talking about them 4,000 years later, which is more than most of us can hope for. Most of us will be forgotten within a few generations, which is fine. Not everyone needs to be remembered. In fact, most people prefer to live their lives without worrying about historical legacy, and that's healthy. The obsession with being remembered is a kind of vanity, though I suppose if you're a king or priest you think differently. You think legacy is everything. You build monuments and commission inscriptions and demand that scribes document your achievements, because what's the point of power if nobody remembers you had it? And this brings us to the fringe interpretation of Sumerian monuments. The idea that the ziggurats were actually ancient power plants or energy devices, that the temples were technological installations rather than religious structures. And this interpretation is based on absolutely nothing. There's no evidence. It's pure speculation motivated by the assumption that ancient peoples couldn't have built impressive structures without advanced technology, which, as I mentioned earlier, is condescending and wrong. The ziggurats were impressive, but they were not impossible. They were well within the capabilities of bronze. Age engineering, you just need a lot of workers and a lot of time and good organizational skills, and the Sumerians had all three. They had large populations, they had centuries to build, and they had sophisticated administrative systems that could coordinate large-scale projects. So no, the ziggurats were not power plants, they were temples, massive artificial mountains designed to bring humans closer to the gods, platforms elevating the sacred above the profane, and they were impressive precisely because they were difficult to build. That was the point, to demonstrate the power and devotion of the city, to create something that would inspire awe in visitors and fear in enemies, and they succeeded. The ziggurats did inspire awe. They still do. Even in ruins they're magnificent, testament to what humans can achieve when we work together toward a common goal. Though of course the goal was imposed from the top down. The workers who actually built the ziggurats probably didn't care much about creating monuments to the gods. They cared about not starving, about feeding their families, about surviving another day, and the fact that their labor created something historically significant was probably not much comfort to them. Immortality through architecture is cold comfort when you're hungry and exhausted and your body hurts from hauling bricks in the desert sun. But history doesn't care about individual suffering. History cares about outcomes, about what gets built and what survives, and the ziggurats survived more or less in ruins and reconstructions, and they tell us something important about Sumerian civilization, about its priorities and values and organizational capacity, and they tell us something about human nature, about our need to build big things, to create monuments, to leave our mark on the landscape, which is a need we still have. We still build skyscrapers and monuments and massive infrastructure projects. We're still trying to prove something to ourselves, if not to the gods. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the impulse to create, to build, to make something that lasts beyond our individual lives is a healthy impulse, a way of connecting with something larger than ourselves. Even if that something is just future humans looking at our ruins and wondering what we were thinking, which is what we do when we look at Sumerian ruins. We wonder what they were thinking, what it meant to them, whether they saw their civilization as eternal, or whether they knew it would end, and the answer is probably both. Probably some Sumerians believed their civilization would last forever, while others suspected it was temporary, just as some of us believe our civilization is permanent while others see collapse on the horizon, and probably both are wrong. Civilizations don't last forever, but they don't completely collapse either. They transform, they get absorbed into successor cultures, they influence what comes next, and Sumerian civilization didn't end so much as evolve into Akkadian civilization, which evolved into Babylonian civilization, which evolved into Persian civilization, and the thread continues, broken and transformed but never entirely severed, and we're part of that thread, inheritors of Sumerian innovations whether we know it or not, and that's both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminds us that we're not the beginning or end of history, we're in the middle. Empowering because it means we're connected to something vast. We're part of a story that began thousands of years before we were born and will continue thousands of years after we die, and our actions matter not because we're special but because we're part of this continuing story. We're the current chapter in a very long book, and what we do shapes what comes next, and what the Sumerians did shaped what came next. Their inventions and innovations spread throughout the ancient world. Writing spread, law codes spread, astronomical knowledge spread, mathematical systems spread, and eventually these innovations reached Greece and Rome, and from there the modern world. So when you write something down, you're using a technology the Sumerians invented. When you organize your day into hours and minutes, you're using a system the Sumerians developed. When you look up at the night sky and see constellations, some of those are Sumerian constellations. We're living in a world shaped by their innovations, and that's worth remembering, worth honoring, not by romanticizing them or pretending they were perfect, but by acknowledging their contributions, by recognizing that we stand on the shoulders of people who lived 4,000 years ago, and they stood on the shoulders of people who came before them, and the chain continues backward into prehistory, into the silent world before writing, before cities, before civilization, and someday people will stand on our shoulders. They'll use technologies we developed. They'll build on foundations we laid, and they'll probably wonder what we were thinking, why we made the choices we made, and hopefully they'll be kind in their judgment. Hopefully they'll recognize that we did our best with what we knew, just as we should recognize that the Sumerians did their best with what they knew, and sometimes their best was impressive, and sometimes it was misguided, and sometimes it was both, because humans are complicated and history is complicated, and there are no simple stories. Only the complex, messy reality of people trying to survive and thrive and make meaning in a chaotic universe. And isn't that enough? Isn't that story worth telling? And isn't that story worth hearing as you drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that humans have been figuring things out for thousands of years, and we're still here, still figuring things out, still building and creating and persisting, and that's pretty remarkable when you think about it, that we're still here after everything, after wars and famines and plagues and catastrophes. Humans persist, civilization persists, the story continues, and you're part of it, and so were the Sumerians, and so will be the people who come after us, and that continuity is beautiful. The goddess Inanna descends into the underworld wearing all her divine regalia, the crown and jewels and powers that make her a goddess, and at each of the 7 gates she must remove one item, one piece of her divinity, until she enters the realm of her sister Ereshkigal naked and powerless. And this myth is about many things. Death, obviously, the stripping away of social position and power, the vulnerability we all face. But it's also about transformation, because Inanna doesn't stay dead, she returns, though changed, and scholars debate what this transformation represents. Professor Betty DeShong-Mador argues it's about psychological wholeness, integrating the dark aspects of self, while others see it as seasonal myth, the death and rebirth of vegetation, and still others interpret it as political allegory, the temporary loss and restoration of power. And all these interpretations have merit because myths are polyvalent. They mean many things simultaneously, and trying to reduce them to single meanings is a modern impulse that the Sumerians would have found strange. Why should a story mean only one thing? Reality is complex, so stories about reality should also be complex, and this complexity is what makes Sumerian mythology so rich and so frustrating, because you can never definitively say what a myth means, you can only offer interpretations, and different interpreters will see different things, and they're all right and all wrong, because the meaning is not fixed. It emerges from the interaction between text and reader, between ancient story and modern consciousness, and this is true of all mythology, of all art, really. Meaning is not inherent in the object, it's created through engagement, and the more deeply you engage with Sumerian mythology, the more layers you discover, the more connections you make, the more questions you have, and the questions are more valuable than the answers, because the questions keep you thinking, keep you engaged, whereas answers tend to shut down inquiry. They provide closure when what you need is opening, and Sumerian mythology refuses closure. It's open-ended, ambiguous, contradictory even. Different texts give different accounts of the same events. Gods behave inconsistently. The cosmology doesn't quite cohere into a single system, and this messiness is not a flaw, it's a feature, because Sumerian religion developed over millennia across dozens of city-states, each with its own traditions and emphases, and nobody ever sat down to systematize it all into a coherent theology. That's a Greek impulse, the desire for logical consistency. The Sumerians were content with contradiction, with multiple overlapping explanations, with mystery, and maybe we could learn from that. Maybe our demand for consistency and certainty is limiting. Maybe we'd be better off embracing ambiguity, sitting with uncertainty, accepting that some questions don't have clear answers, though I recognize that's not a satisfying bedtime message. You probably want closure and certainty. You want me to explain exactly what the Sumerians believed and what it meant, but I can't do that. Nobody can. We have texts and artifacts, but we don't have access to the lived experience of Sumerian religion. We don't know what it felt like to believe in Inanna, or Enki, or Enlil. We can reconstruct the outlines of practice, the festivals and rituals and prayers, but the subjective interior experience is lost, and that loss is profound. Because religion is not primarily about beliefs and practices, it's about experience, about the felt sense of connection to something larger than yourself, and that experience leaves no trace in the archaeological record. It exists only in the moment, and then it's gone, though it may have lasting effects on the person who experienced it, and those effects may ripple outward into culture and history, but the experience itself is ephemeral, and this is why studying ancient religion is so difficult. We're trying to understand something that was fundamentally experiential through texts and objects that are not experiential. It's like trying to understand music by reading the score without ever hearing it performed. You can learn a lot, but you're missing something essential: the actual sound, the emotional impact, the way it moves through your body. And Sumerian religion moved through bodies. It was embodied practice, ritual action, processions, dances, offerings, festivals. The body was the site where divine and human met, and reducing this to texts and beliefs misses the point. Though texts and beliefs are all we have, so we work with them. We read the hymns and try to imagine what it was like to sing them. We look at temple layouts and try to imagine what it was like to process through them. We study ritual texts and try to reconstruct what happened, but it's all reconstruction, educated guesswork, informed speculation, and we should be honest about that. We should acknowledge the limits of historical knowledge rather than pretending we can fully understand ancient cultures, because we can't. There's always a gap, always distance, and that gap is not a failure of method or evidence, it's inherent in the historical enterprise. The past is genuinely foreign. People really did think differently, experience differently, conceptualize reality differently, and while we can learn a lot through careful study, there are limits, things we cannot access, and accepting those limits is important. It keeps us humble, prevents us from projecting our own assumptions onto ancient peoples. Though of course we do project our assumptions, we can't help it. We see the past through the lens of our own concerns and categories, and every generation of scholars sees something different in the same evidence, because we're asking different questions, bringing different perspectives. And this is fine actually. This is how knowledge grows, through multiple perspectives and ongoing dialogue, not through the accumulation of definitive facts, but through the multiplication of interpretations, and each interpretation illuminates something while obscuring something else. And the goal is not to find the one true interpretation, but to expand the range of possibilities, to see more aspects of the complex reality that was ancient Sumer. And speaking of complex realities, let's discuss the fringe theory that Sumerian civilization was founded by survivors from Atlantis, which is nonsense obviously. Atlantis was invented by Plato as a philosophical thought experiment. It was never a real place, but the theory persists because people want ancient mysteries. They want lost civilizations and hidden knowledge. They want the past to be more dramatic and exciting than it actually was. And I understand the impulse. Reality can be disappointing. The truth is often less interesting than the fantasy. Ancient Sumer was not. Founded by Atlantean refugees, it developed gradually from local Neolithic cultures through a long process of agricultural intensification, social stratification, and technological development, which is actually more impressive than the Atlantis theory, because it means humans did it ourselves. We created civilization through our own ingenuity and effort. We didn't need help from lost advanced civilizations or ancient astronauts. We figured it out, which is remarkable, but also less sensational than ancient mysteries, and sensationalism sells, mystery sells, conspiracy theories sell, whereas the truth is often mundane and complicated and doesn't fit into neat narratives, and I'm sympathetic to the desire for neat narratives. I'm trying to create one right now, a coherent story about ancient Sumer that flows smoothly and makes sense, but the reality resists coherence. It's messy and contradictory and full of gaps, and maybe I should be more honest about that. Maybe instead of trying to smooth over the gaps, I should highlight them, should say, here's what we know, and here's what we don't know, and here's what we think we know but might be wrong about. But that's not conducive to the bedtime story format. You want smoothness and flow. You want me to lull you to sleep with gentle explanations, not wake you up with epistemological uncertainty, though personally I find uncertainty soothing, the recognition that we don't have all the answers, that mystery remains, that the universe is larger and stranger than our comprehension, and maybe that's just me. Maybe most people find uncertainty anxiety-inducing, prefer the comfort of certainty even when that certainty is false, and there's no judgment in that observation. We all need different things to feel secure, and if you need certainty, then by all means believe what you need to believe, though I gently suggest that false certainty is brittle. It breaks when confronted with contradictory evidence, whereas comfort with uncertainty is flexible, adaptive, able to incorporate new information without shattering your worldview. But again, maybe that's just me, projecting my own values onto you, assuming you share my epistemological commitments, when maybe you don't. Maybe you're listening to this because you like history, not because you want philosophical musings about the nature of knowledge. And that's fair. I do get distracted. We were talking about Sumerian religion and somehow ended up discussing epistemology, which is typical of how my brain works. Everything connects to everything else. Every topic spirals outward into related topics. And while this makes for comprehensive understanding, it doesn't make for focused presentation, but we're past the point of focus. We're deep into the ramble now, and the ramble is the point, the gentle meandering through topics, the associative logic that mimics how the mind works when it's relaxing, when it's not trying to be efficient or productive, when it's just following connections and seeing where they lead, and where they lead is back to Sumer. always back to Sumer, because that's our nominal topic, though we've ranged far and wide in our exploration, touching on everything from epistemology to alcohol to accounting, which is appropriate because Sumerian civilization touched on everything. It was comprehensive, it addressed every aspect of human experience, and the texts that survive reflect that comprehensiveness. We have everything from profound religious hymns to mundane administrative records, from epic poetry to complaints about copper quality, and all of it matters. All of it tells us something about how the Sumerians lived and thought and made sense of their world, and the world they made sense of was both familiar and strange. Familiar in its basic human concerns, food, shelter, relationships, meaning, strange in its specific cultural expressions, in the particular ways they addressed those concerns, and this combination of familiar and strange is what makes ancient history so engaging. You recognize yourself in ancient peoples while also recognizing the distance, the difference, and this dual recognition is valuable. It expands your sense of what it means to be human, shows you that humanity is more various and creative than you might have assumed, that there are many ways to be human, many ways to organize society, many ways to relate to the divine, and none of them is the only way or the right way. They're just different ways, each with its own logic and its own trade-offs, and the Sumerian way was to see divinity in everything, in the rivers and storms and harvest, in human institutions and social roles, in the order that made civilization possible, and this pervasive divinity gave meaning to all aspects of life. Nothing was purely mundane because everything had cosmic significance, and while we might see that as superstition or primitive thinking, it's worth considering what we've lost in our disenchanted world, where nothing is sacred, where everything is reduced to mechanism and matter, where meaning is scarce and must be individually constructed rather than collectively discovered. And I'm not saying we should return to Sumerian religion, that would be absurd, but maybe we could learn something from their integrated worldview, their sense that human life is embedded in larger patterns and purposes, whether we call those patterns divine or natural or cosmic or something else. The specific metaphysics don't matter as much as the sense of connection, of belonging to something greater than ourselves, and if this video gives you even a moment of that sense, a brief feeling of connection to the vast span of human history, to the millions of people who lived and died before you, to the continuity of human experience across millennia, then I'll consider it successful, because that's what history is for, not just to inform, but to connect, to remind us that we're not alone, that we're part of a story much larger than ourselves, and that story includes ancient Sumerians pressing wedges into clay, and medieval monks copying manuscripts, and Renaissance artists painting frescoes, and industrial workers building factories, and it includes you, right now, lying in bed, listening to someone ramble about ancient Mesopotamia, and all of these moments are connected, all of them part of the great web of human experience. And recognizing that connection is profound, or at least I think it's profound. Maybe you think it's obvious, or maybe you're asleep now and not thinking about it at all, which would be fine. That's the goal, to help you sleep. And if my rambling about Sumerian civilization and epistemology and the nature of historical knowledge has helped you relax enough to sleep, then I've succeeded. And if it's kept you awake because it's too interesting or too annoying, then I've failed. But either way, here we are, still in section 4, still exploring the silent world, that time before divine intervention, though we've spent most of this section talking about what came after, about developed Sumerian civilization with its writing and temples and complex mythology, because the silent world itself is difficult to discuss. We have no direct evidence, no texts because writing hadn't been invented, no detailed archaeological record because settlements were small and ephemeral, just hints and fragments, stones, tools and pottery shards and the faint traces of ancient camps. And from these fragments we try to reconstruct what life was like, and mostly what we reconstruct is hardship, difficulty, the constant struggle for survival, and maybe that's accurate. Maybe life before civilization was harsh and brief. Or maybe we're projecting our own assumptions, our belief that civilization is progress and therefore what came before must have been worse when maybe people were happier in small, egalitarian bands, living close to nature without the hierarchies and conflicts that came with larger societies, and we'll never know, we can't ask them, and the question of whether people were happier before civilization is probably meaningless anyway, because happiness is subjective and culturally constructed, and comparing happiness across radically different contexts doesn't make sense. But we can say that life was different, that people experienced reality differently, that the categories we use to organize experience, work and leisure, public and private, natural and artificial, didn't exist or meant different things, and that difference is worth pondering, worth sitting with, because it denaturalizes our own experience, shows us that how we live is not the only way to live, is not inevitable or natural but contingent and constructed, and that recognition is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means we could live differently, terrifying because it means we're responsible for how we live. We can't blame nature or fate or divine decree. We have choice, and choice is burden as well as freedom. But I'm getting philosophical again, drifting away from Sumer, though perhaps these digressions are appropriate. Perhaps the point is not to stay strictly on topic but to wander, to explore, to see where thoughts lead, and where they lead is always back to the same fundamental questions. How should we live? What matters? What gives life meaning? And the Sumerians had answers to these questions, not the answers, just their answers, their particular culturally specific historically contingent answers, and we have different answers, and people in the future will have different answers still. And none of these answers is final or definitive. They're all provisional, experiments in being human, and the experiment continues, and will continue long after we're gone. And that's comforting in a way, knowing that the story doesn't end with us. That humanity will persist, adapting and changing, creating new forms of life and meaning, just as the Sumerians did, just as every generation does, and our contribution to that ongoing story is to live as well as we can, to create what beauty and meaning we can, to reduce suffering where possible, to increase flourishing where possible, and to pass on what we've learned to the next generation, just as the Sumerians passed on what they learned, through their texts and innovations, through the institutional frameworks they created, through the questions they asked and the answers they attempted, and maybe some of our answers are better than theirs, and maybe some are worse, but all are sincere attempts to make sense of existence, and that sincerity matters, that effort matters, regardless of whether we succeed, because the trying itself is meaningful. The attempt to understand and improve and create is what makes us human, and the Sumerians were deeply human, flawed and brilliant, cruel and kind, petty and profound, just like us, and recognizing that shared humanity across 4,000 years is the real gift of history. The Sumerian king list opens with a line that has puzzled scholars for over a century, when kingship was lowered from heaven, which raises immediate questions about what kingship meant to the Sumerians, whether it was a divine gift or human institution, and whether the distinction between divine and human even made sense in their conceptual framework. And Professor Thorkild Jacobson devoted much of his career to arguing that Sumerian political theory was based on assembly democracy, that early Sumerian city-states were governed by councils of elders with kings serving as temporary war leaders, and this interpretation has been influential though also contested. Other scholars point out that the evidence for assembly democracy is limited, that most of our sources come from periods when kingship was already well established, and that projecting democratic ideals onto ancient Mesopotamia might be wishful thinking. And honestly, both sides make good points. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, which is frustrating if you want definitive answers but interesting if you appreciate complexity. And what's particularly interesting is how the debate reflects our own political commitments. Scholars who value democracy see democracy in ancient Sumer. Scholars who emphasize hierarchy and authoritarianism see that instead. And maybe the truth is that Sumerian political organization varied by time and place and circumstance, that some cities were more democratic while others were more autocratic, that political systems evolved over the centuries, and that trying to characterize all of Sumerian civilization with a single political model is reductive, because civilizations are not monolithic, they're complex adaptive systems with internal variation and change over time, and acknowledging that complexity is important even if it makes our explanations less neat and satisfying, because neatness and satisfaction are not the goals. Of historical study, understanding is the goal, and understanding requires sitting with ambiguity and resisting the urge to simplify. Though I recognize that's difficult, our brains like patterns and categories. We want to sort things into boxes, good or bad, democratic or authoritarian, advanced or primitive, and the reality is usually neither nor. Usually, it's both and. Sumer was sophisticated in some ways and limited in others, egalitarian in some contexts and hierarchical in others, progressive in some areas and traditional in others. And these contradictions are not flaws. They're the natural result of complex societies responding to multiple pressures and constraints. And if you're still awake, if you're still following this meandering exploration of Sumerian political theory, I'm impressed, because this is pretty dry material. Political theory is not everyone's idea of soothing bedtime content, but there's something calming about intellectual discussion, about following an argument through its premises and conclusions, about the orderly progression of ideas, even when those ideas don't lead to clear conclusions, and maybe especially when they don't lead to clear conclusions. Because uncertainty is honest, it reflects the actual state of our knowledge, and honesty is more soothing than false certainty, at least to me, though your mileage may vary. And speaking of varying mileage, let's discuss the fringe theory that Sumerian kings were actually immortal or extremely long-lived due to advanced technology or genetic engineering. And this theory is based on the king list's claims that antediluvian kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, which, as I mentioned earlier, is either metaphorical or mathematical error, or mythological time, but definitely not literal, because humans do not live for 30,000 years. That's not how biology works. Our cells accumulate damage, our telomeres shorten, our systems gradually fail. Death is inevitable, at least with current biology, and while it's theoretically possible that future technology could extend lifespan dramatically, maybe even indefinitely, there's no evidence that ancient Sumerians had such technology. None. The archaeological record shows Bronze Age technology, stone tools and copper implements and early writing, not genetic engineering or life extension treatments. And the fact that we have to keep stating this obvious point is frustrating. But here we are, living in an age where ancient astronaut theories are popular entertainment, and people actually believe that pyramids were power plants. And I suppose we shouldn't be too critical. People have always believed weird things. Humans are pattern-seeking animals, and we see patterns even when none exist. We create elaborate explanations for random events. We find meaning in coincidence. It's what we do. It's how our brains work. And in some contexts, this tendency is useful. Pattern recognition helps us navigate complex environments, but in other contexts, it leads us astray, makes us see conspiracies where there's just chaos, makes us see ancient wisdom where there's just ancient people making do with limited knowledge. And ancient people had limited knowledge. They did the best they could with what they had. They observed nature carefully and drew conclusions. And sometimes their conclusions were accurate, and sometimes they weren't. And they created myths to explain what they observed. And myths are not the same as scientific theories. They're not trying to be empirically accurate. They're trying to be meaningful. They're trying to locate human experience within a comprehensible cosmic framework, and judging them by scientific standards misses the point. It's category error, and yet we do it constantly. We look at ancient myths and say, look how wrong they were. They thought the earth was flat, or that the sun was a god or whatever, when really we should be saying, look how creative they were. Look how they made sense of their experience with the tools they had. Look how they created meaning in the face of chaos and mortality. And the Sumerians were particularly good at creating meaning. Their mythology is rich and complex and psychologically sophisticated. Their hymns are beautiful. Their laments are moving. They understood grief and loss and longing. They understood that life is difficult and brief and precious. And they created rituals and stories to help people cope with that reality. And those rituals and stories worked. They provided comfort and meaning for thousands of years, which is more than can be said for most modern psychological theories that become obsolete within decades. So maybe we should be more respectful of ancient wisdom, even as we recognize its limitations. Maybe we should acknowledge that different kinds of knowledge serve different purposes. Scientific knowledge helps us manipulate the material world, but doesn't necessarily help us find meaning. Mythological knowledge doesn't help us build bridges but does help us navigate existential questions, and we need both. We need material mastery and existential meaning, and the Sumerians had a better balance than we do. They integrated the practical and the spiritual in ways we've lost, though admittedly their integration came with costs, with superstition and with religious authority constraining inquiry. But our separation also comes with costs, with alienation and meaninglessness and the feeling that something's missing even when all material needs are met. And maybe the solution is not to return to pre-modern integration, but to find a new integration that preserves both scientific understanding and existential meaning, though I have no idea how to achieve that. It's above my pay grade. I just make videos about ancient history. I don't have solutions to the meaning crisis of modernity, though if I did, I probably wouldn't be making videos about ancient Sumer. I'd be starting a religion or something. Though starting a religion seems like a lot of work and probably ends badly. Historically speaking, most religious founders either get crucified or corrupted by power or both. So maybe it's better to just talk about ancient Sumer and let other people worry about saving the world. And speaking of saving the world, the Sumerians had their own apocalyptic myths, stories about floods that destroyed civilization, about divine anger that wiped out humanity. And these myths served a purpose. They reminded people that order is fragile, that civilization could collapse, that the gods could withdraw their favor, and this reminder encouraged proper behavior, maintained social norms, reinforced religious observance, because if you believe that improper behavior could bring divine wrath in the form of catastrophic flood, you're more likely to behave properly, at least by the society's standards, though of course people still misbehaved. Humans always misbehave. That's what we do. We test boundaries and break rules and generally fail to live up to our ideals, and the Sumerians knew this. Their laws and religious texts are full of recognition that humans are flawed, that we need guidance and correction and forgiveness, and this recognition is surprisingly modern, or perhaps modernity is surprisingly ancient. Perhaps we haven't changed as much as we like to think. Perhaps the human condition is relatively constant, and what changes is just the technological and social context. And if that's true, then maybe studying ancient history is not just interesting but essential, because it shows us the constants, the things that don't change, the persistent features of human nature and society, and understanding those constants helps us navigate our own time, helps us distinguish between what's truly new and what's just old patterns in new forms. And a lot of what we think is new is actually old. Social media is just gossip at scale. Political polarization is nothing new. Wealth inequality is ancient. Warfare is eternal. Humans have been struggling with the same basic problems for thousands of years. We just have better tools now, better weapons, better surveillance, better propaganda, better means of both oppression and liberation. And the question is what we do with those tools, whether we use them to increase human flourishing or to concentrate power, whether we learn from history or repeat its mistakes, and mostly, we repeat its mistakes. Humans are not great at learning from history. We know this. Every generation thinks they've figured it out, thinks they're different from previous generations, thinks they won't make the same errors, and then they make the same errors, and future generations look back and wonder how they could have been so blind, and those future generations will make their own errors, and their descendants will wonder about them, and the cycle continues, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the cycle is part of the human condition. Maybe we're supposed to keep making mistakes and learning and growing. Maybe the process is the point, not reaching some final destination of perfect wisdom, and the Sumerians would probably agree with that. Their mythology doesn't promise perfection or ultimate salvation. It just promises that life continues, that the gods will continue to be gods and humans will continue to be humans, and the world will keep turning. And there's something comforting about that lack of eschatology, that absence of end times, the recognition that this is it, this is life, messy and difficult and beautiful and brief, and we should make the most of it because nothing else is guaranteed, and making the most of it means different things to different people. For some it means building great monuments, for others it means raising children, for others it means creating art or pursuing knowledge or just surviving with dignity, and all These ways of making the most of life are valid, all are worthy. The Sumerian scribe copying tablets, and the Sumerian farmer planting barley, and the Sumerian priestess performing rituals were all contributing to the continuation of civilization, all playing their part in the great web of social reproduction, and we're doing the same thing, right now, in our own contexts. We're all playing our parts, maintaining the systems that sustain us, and sometimes those systems need to be changed, need to be reformed or replaced, but mostly they just need to be maintained, and maintenance is undervalued in our culture. We celebrate innovation and disruption, but most of life is maintenance, keeping things running, fixing what breaks, doing the daily work that keeps civilization functioning, and the Sumerians understood this. Their administrative texts are full of maintenance work, repairs to irrigation canals, upkeep of temples, routine agricultural tasks, all the unglamorous labor that made civilization possible. And maybe we should honor that labor more. Maybe we should recognize that the people who maintain infrastructure and care for children and teach students and grow food are doing essential work. Our civilization, in a way that stock traders and social media influencers are not. Though obviously I'm revealing my own biases here, my own values about what matters, and maybe stock traders would argue they provide essential services, facilitating capital allocation and liquidity, and fine, maybe they do. I'm not an economist, but it's hard to shake the feeling that some work is more essential than others, that growing food is more valuable than speculation, that teaching is more important than marketing, and the Sumerians would probably agree. Their social hierarchy placed practical skills like farming and craft work above mercantile activities, though of course merchants could become wealthy and powerful. Economic success has always conferred status, regardless of official ideologies, and this tension between official values and actual practice is constant throughout history. Societies say one thing and reward another. They claim to value certain activities while structurally incentivizing different activities, and individuals navigate these contradictions as best they can, doing what they need to do to survive while trying to maintain some sense of integrity and meaning. And it's hard. It's always been hard. Humans have always struggled to reconcile their ideals with the practical demands of survival, and the struggle is not a sign of failure, it's just the human condition, and recognizing that, accepting that, is perhaps the first step toward peace, toward being able to sleep at night despite all the contradictions and injustices and absurdities of existence. And maybe that's what this video is really about. Not ancient Sumer specifically, but the search for peace, for acceptance, for the ability to rest despite everything. And if ancient Sumer can help with that, if contemplating the vast sweep of history can provide some perspective and comfort, then we've achieved something valuable, something worth the 20,000 words or however many words this ends up being. And if you're still listening, still following along, I appreciate you. I appreciate your willingness to take this journey with me through ancient Mesopotamia and epistemology and the nature of meaning. It's been a strange journey, but hopefully a worthwhile one, and we're almost done now. Just one more section to go, and then you can sleep or do whatever else you do late at night when you're listening to someone ramble about 4,000-year-old civilizations, and whatever that is. I hope it brings you peace. I hope it helps you rest, because rest is important. It's when our brains process and integrate and make sense of things. And maybe that's what we've been doing here, processing and integrating 4,000 years of human experience, making sense of how we got from there to here, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to your bedroom in whatever year you're listening to this. And the journey has been long and strange and full of detours, but we've arrived, almost. Just one more section, just a few more minutes of gentle rambling about ancient history, and then you can rest. The silent world before divine intervention was probably not silent at all, but rather full of sounds we can barely imagine. The rustle of reed marshes where early settlements huddled, the call of birds that have since gone extinct, the voices of people speaking languages that left no written trace, the rhythms of work and ritual that structured days and seasons. And when we call it silent, we mean only that it left no written record, no text for us to read, no voice that speaks directly across the millennia. But silence in the archive is not the same as silence in lived experience, and this distinction matters because it reminds us that most of human history is lost. Most people who ever lived left no trace. Their names and stories and daily concerns vanished when they died, and only a tiny fraction of human experience survived in the form of texts and artifacts. and that tiny fraction shapes our understanding of the past, which means our understanding is deeply skewed. We know about elites and institutions, about kings and priests and monumental architecture, but we know much less about ordinary people, about farmers and workers and slaves, about women and children, about all the people who didn't have access to literacy or who lived lives too humble to warrant documentation. And this is the great tragedy of history, not that civilizations fall, but that most people are forgotten, that most human experience is lost, and we do our best to reconstruct what we can from the evidence that survives, but the evidence is always incomplete, always biased toward the powerful, and acknowledging this bias is important. It keeps us humble, prevents us from making overly confident claims about the past, and it also spurs us to look for alternative sources, to find ways to access the experiences of people who didn't leave texts, through archaeology, through anthropology, through careful reading of the gaps and silences in the official record, because what's not said is often as important as what is said, and the Sumerian texts are full of revealing silences. They tell us about temple administration, but not about what ordinary people thought of the temples. They record royal achievements, but not the costs those achievements imposed on workers. They describe religious festivals, but not whether people actually believed or were just going through the motions. And we have to read between the lines, have to infer and speculate and acknowledge uncertainty. And this is why history is not just about facts, but about interpretation, about bringing our own questions and perspectives to bear on incomplete evidence. And different historians will see different things in the same evidence, will ask different questions and arrive at different conclusions. And that's not a failure of historical method, it's a feature. It's how knowledge progresses through dialogue and debate and the gradual refinement of understanding, and we're still refining our understanding of Sumer, still making new discoveries, still having new insights, and this process will continue long after we're gone. Future historians will have access to evidence we don't have, will bring perspectives we can't imagine, will see things in the Sumerian record that we've missed, and they'll also miss things that seem obvious to us, because every generation is blind in its own ways, trapped in its own assumptions and categories, and the best we can do is try to be aware of our limitations, try to see past our biases, try to approach the past with humility and respect, recognizing that the Sumerians were not waiting for us to understand them. They lived their lives for their own purposes, created their civilization for their own reasons, and we're just looking back from a distance, trying to make sense of fragmentary evidence, and sometimes we succeed, and sometimes we fail, and mostly we do both. We get some things right and other things wrong, and we won't know which is which until future historians correct us, and that's okay. That's how knowledge works. It's provisional and revisable, always open to correction, and this openness is a strength, not a weakness. It means we can improve, can incorporate new evidence, can change our minds when confronted with better arguments. And I've changed my mind about many things while researching Sumerian history. I've had confident interpretations demolished by new evidence, had pet theories proven wrong, had assumptions challenged, and each time it's been valuable. Each correction has brought me closer to understanding, though I'll never fully understand, none of us will, because the past is genuinely foreign, and the gap between our experience and Sumerian experience is vast. But the attempt to bridge that gap is worthwhile. The effort to understand people who lived 4,000 years ago expands our sense of what's possible, shows us different ways of being human, challenges our assumptions about what's natural or inevitable, and these are valuable lessons. They make us more flexible, more adaptable, more able to imagine alternatives to our current arrangements, and imagination is essential for change. You have to be able to imagine something different before you can create it, and studying history feeds imagination, shows us that things have been different and therefore could be different again, and maybe that's the most important lesson from ancient Sumer. Not any specific fact or date or detail, but the simple recognition that human societies are malleable, changeable, that we created civilization and we can change it. And this recognition is both empowering and daunting. Empowering because it means we have agency. Daunting because it means we have responsibility. We can't blame nature or fate or the gods. We have to take ownership of our choices and their consequences. And the Sumerians took ownership of their choices. They built irrigation, systems and cities and institutions. They created literature and law and complex social structures. And yes, some of their choices led to problems, to environmental degradation and social inequality, and eventually to decline. But they tried, they made the attempt. They didn't just accept things as they were, they shaped their environment and their society, and that active shaping is what defines civilization. The collective effort to create something that transcends individual lives, that persists across generations, that gives meaning and structure to human existence. And the meaning the Sumerians created persisted for over 2,000 years, which is remarkable, which is a testament to the power of their innovations and the resilience of their culture. And when their civilization finally did collapse, when the city-states were conquered and absorbed into larger empires, their innovations survived. Their writing system was adapted by other languages, their mathematical systems were adopted by other cultures, their literature influenced later traditions, and in this way Sumerian civilization never really ended, it just transformed, became part of the larger stream of human culture, and that stream flows to us. We're still using Sumerian innovations, still telling stories influenced by Sumerian myths, still organizing our time according to Sumerian mathematics, and this continuity is profound. It means that when we use writing or law, or divide the day into hours, we're participating in a tradition that began in ancient Sumer. We're continuing work that they started, and that makes us part of something larger than ourselves, part of a project that spans millennia, the great human project of creating and maintaining civilization, and that project continues, will continue long after we're gone, and future humans will use innovations we develop, will be influenced by stories we tell, will continue the work we started, and the chain continues forward just as it continues backward, and we're a link in that chain, temporary but essential, and what we do matters, how we live matters, the choices we make shape what's possible for future generations. And this is true whether we're kings or farmers, scribes or laborers, we all contribute to the collective project. We all matter, and the Sumerians understood this. Their texts honor all kinds of contributions. Hymns praise gods, but also praise skilled craftsmen, praise just kings, but also praise good harvests, praise wisdom, but also praise the work of irrigation and building. And this comprehensive honoring of contribution is something we've lost. We focus too narrowly on individual achievement, on greatness and genius, when really civilization is the result of millions of people doing ordinary work, maintaining systems, raising children, passing on knowledge, and that ordinary work deserves honor, deserves recognition, and maybe one purpose of history is to provide that recognition, to remember and honor all the people who came before, whose work made our lives possible, who contributed to the great project whether they were famous or anonymous, powerful or powerless, and the Sumerians were mostly anonymous to us. We know some names, some kings and priests, but most of the people who built the irrigation systems and baked the tablets and harvested the barley are nameless, forgotten, and yet their work survives. The systems they maintained persisted. The civilization they built lasted millennia, and that's their monument. More durable than any ziggurat, the simple fact that they succeeded in creating something that outlasted them, and we're doing the same thing right now, in our own way. We're creating systems and institutions and knowledge that will outlast us, that will benefit people we'll never meet. And that's beautiful, that's meaningful, even if we're never remembered, even if our names are forgotten. The fact that we contributed matters. The fact that we were here and did our part is sufficient. And maybe that's the final lesson from the silent world, that being remembered is not what matters. What matters is having lived, having contributed, having been part of the great chain of human existence. And the people who lived in the silent world before writing, before cities, before the gods allegedly lowered kingship from heaven, those people mattered too. They contributed too. They survived and reproduced and passed on knowledge, and without them there would be no Sumerian civilization, no writing, no history, nothing for us to study and talk about. They're the foundation, the base of the pyramid that supports everything above. And they're forgotten, completely erased from the record, and yet they mattered. They were essential, and maybe we can honor them by remembering that most people throughout history have been forgotten, that anonymity is the norm and fame is the exception, and that's okay. That's not tragic, because the goal is not to be remembered, but to live well, to contribute what you can, to find meaning in the daily work of existence, and the Sumerians found meaning. They created rich cultures and meaningful lives, and then they died and were mostly forgotten. And that's the human story, repeated billions of times. We live and die and are forgotten, and it's sad but also beautiful, because it means that what matters is not the remembering but the living, not the monument but the moment, not the legacy but the life. And if you're lying there thinking about your own mortality, about the fact that you too will die and be forgotten, try not to be sad. Try instead to appreciate the simple fact of being alive right now, in this moment, breathing and thinking and existing, which is remarkable when you think about it, that the universe has arranged itself in such a way that you can be conscious, can experience, can know that you're alive, and that's a miracle, or if not a miracle, then at least deeply strange and wonderful. And the Sumerians felt this too. Their texts express wonder at existence, gratitude for life even with all its difficulties, and maybe that's the attitude we should cultivate. Not denial of difficulty, but appreciation despite difficulty, recognition that life is hard but also precious, brief but meaningful, and the meaning comes not from lasting forever, but from having been here at all, from having participated in the great adventure of existence. And if this video has helped you feel that, if contemplating ancient Sumer has given you some perspective on your own life, has helped you feel connected to the vast sweep of human history, then I'm glad. That was the goal, to provide comfort and perspective and maybe even meaning, through the gentle exploration of how people lived and thought and made sense of their world 4,000 years ago. And now we've reached the end of our journey. We've traveled from the temples of Uruk to the marshes of Eridu, from cuneiform tablets to cylinder seals, from myths of creation to debates about political organization, and through it all, we've been accompanied by the ghosts of ancient Sumerians, the priests and scribes and farmers and workers who built the first civilization, who invented writing and law and bureaucracy, who looked up at the same stars we see and wondered about the same questions we ask, and they're gone now. Dust and memory, but their work remains, inscribed in clay, embedded in culture, woven into the fabric of human civilization, and we're their heirs, their descendants not in blood but in culture, and we owe them something, recognition at least, acknowledgement that we stand on their shoulders, that our civilization would not exist without their innovations, and maybe also gratitude for having shown us what's possible, for having demonstrated that humans can create meaning and order out of chaos, can build cities that last millennia, can write words that outlive their authors. And if we can do that, if they could do that 4,000 years ago with limited technology and Bronze Age resources, then maybe we can do it too. Maybe we can create something lasting, something meaningful, something worth passing on to future generations. Or maybe we can't. Maybe we'll fail. Maybe our civilization will collapse just as theirs did. But even if we fail, even if everything we build eventually crumbles, the attempt will have been worthwhile. The effort will have mattered, because that's what humans do. We build and create and strive, knowing that nothing lasts forever, knowing that we'll die and be forgotten. And we do it anyway, because the alternative is not to try at all, and not trying is not living. And if the Sumerians taught us anything, it's that life, even difficult life, even brief life, is worth living, worth celebrating, worth documenting in wedge-shaped impressions on clay tablets that will outlast us all. And on that note, as you drift off to sleep, surrounded by the comfort of your modern bed and the safety of your home, take a moment to appreciate the long chain of human effort that made this moment possible. All the people who lived and worked and died so that you could exist, so that you could have this life, this moment of rest and contemplation, and know that you're part of that chain, that your life matters too, that what you do ripples forward into the future just as what the Sumerians did rippled forward to us. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we need to know, that we're connected, that we matter, that the silent world was never really silent but always full of voices, and those voices continue speaking across the void of time, telling us that humans have always struggled and persevered, always built and created, always found meaning in the face of chaos, and if they could do it, so can we. And that's a comforting thought to hold as you drift into sleep. The knowledge that you're not alone, that millions of humans across thousands of years have faced the same challenges and fears and questions, and somehow we keep going. somehow the story continues, and you're part of that story, an essential part, and your contribution matters even if you're never remembered, even if your name disappears into the silence of history, because you were here, you existed, you were part of the great chain of being, and that's enough. That's everything. And now, after this long journey through Sumerian civilization and human history, and the nature of meaning and memory, it's time to rest, time to let go, time to drift into sleep, knowing that you're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, that the story that began in Sumer 4,000 years ago continues in you, and will continue long after you're gone, and that continuity is beautiful, that persistence is meaningful, and you can rest now. You can let the weight of history settle over. You like a blanket, warm and heavy and comforting, and know that you are held by this great chain of human connection, that you belong to this story, that you matter, and that's enough, more than enough. And sweet dreams, dear listener, sweet dreams.